is about the power of silence as a source of mental clarity, of physical health, and answers, solutions to challenges facing humanity, both at a personal level and as societies, communities, and the globe as a whole. The impetus for writing this book was the simple question, what are we going to do about this crazy world? How are we possibly going to be effective in helping to bring more sanity right now? And we both had this intuition that the answers to the problems we're facing might not all be solved with more thinking and talking, that there's a necessity to turn down the noise and tune into silence. It's been a surprising journey for us discovering our definition of noise and silence. We wrote an article for Harvard Business Review about the power of silence in a literal auditory sense for mental clarity in our health and relationships and ability to generate good ideas. The article resonated with folks, and we ended up continuing to follow the breadcrumbs and interview neuroscientists and poets and philosophers and someone on death row, a heavy metal star, a Grammy-winning opera singer, all about this question of what's the deepest silence you've ever known? And the answers surprised us because they weren't all auditorily quiet. While some people were describing balmy mornings and sunrise over a vast ocean, other people were describing situations that sounded auditorily loud, like running the perfect line through roaring rapids, or births or deaths, or even the 4 a.m. mark at an all-night dance party. But what they were describing were moments of pristine attention, where nothing was making claims on the consciousness.
Just that that question and what it provoked led us to look beyond just auditory noise. But we do look at auditory noise that we measure in decibels and think of often as happening to our ears and maybe to our nervous systems when it's really loud. And then we go further into informational noise, that which is grabbing for our attention, which is increasing exponentially right now, while our ability to process that information is not increasing. And then we look at internal noise, that which happens in our consciousness, like rumination and worry and anxiety, also on the rise in our day in these times.
Human beings have always complained about the noise of the world. 2,500 years ago in South Asia, people were complaining about the sounds of cymbals and gongs and street vendors saying, "Eat, yea, and drink." The Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods sent a great flood to wipe out the earth because of all the noise that humanity was generating. But in our research, we've found that it is an empirical fact that the world is louder than it's ever been. And it's not just a little bit more auditory noise. There is a mass proliferation of mental stimulation in our world today. There is empirical evidence that the world is louder than it's ever been by looking to proxies like emergency vehicles, because fire engine sirens, for example, have to be loud enough to break through the surrounding soundscape. The volume of their sirens is a proxy for that loudness. And over the last 100 years, fire engine alarm sirens have gotten to be 6 times louder than they were previously.
The former CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, estimates that the amount of information we're creating is equal to that from the beginning of civilization to 2003, and that we're creating that much information every day. There is an exponential amount of information in our surroundings that is grabbing for our attention increasingly with notifications and buzzing and, whooshing and all these things pinging. So that is increasing while our ability to process that information is not. So we are concerned about that informational noise as well as the internal noise, that which is in our consciousness. So the professor at University of Michigan, Ethan Cross, estimates that we listen to something like 320 State of the Union addresses every day in our brains. That compressed internal speech is just going nonstop. The answers to the question we asked, what's the deepest silence you've ever known, really helped shape this book, really led us to understand that this is more than an auditory exploration, that we also want to look at silence beyond the absence of noise, but silence as a presence. Because they noticed things that were auditorily loud. They named things like births and deaths and moments of awe, moments where the words just fail us. These were also moments where they were often not alone. They were often in shared silence, deep shared silence.
In these conversations with people about this meaning of the deepest silence they've ever known, we spoke, for example, to Tyson Yunka Porta, who's an academic and also a member of an Aboriginal clan in Queensland, Australia, who told us that in his Indigenous language, there's no such thing as silence. There's no word for silence because nature abhors a vacuum, and there's no such thing as the absolute absence of sound and stimulus, probably anywhere in the universe. But he said that you could describe the meaning of what we're talking about as silence as the ability to perceive a signal.
That's one of those places we're looking at silence as a starting place to discern the signal from the noise. It is a place for us to take stock on what is true, needing our attention, a signal, and what is a noise, what is a distraction, distracting us from what really we want to put our attention to. That's really the time and space we're most interested in. How do we integrate this into our busy, noise-soaked lives where we're engaged in doing all the things we want to do? Justin and I both have families, young kids. We're involved in high-stress work on climate and pollution and violence prevention, things like this. So we were interested in answering this question: how do we weave silence into a busy, noise-soaked life? How do we stay engaged in these questions and in this time while also finding silence? So we're looking at little moments in the day that we can take, little mini breaks to connect to the deeper silence that helps us with that clarity and that place of discernment, as well as more rapturous moments, deeper moments of silence where we can take a bigger pause and assess what we're doing with this precious life of ours.
And the core element of this is simply about appreciating silence in our lives. So many of us have meditated at one time or another. It's a practice Lee and I have both appreciated and gotten a lot out of in our lives. I had some experience teaching meditation on Capitol Hill when I worked as a policymaker in DC. And Lee has also had experience as a mindfulness teacher through her work with coalitions and leadership coaching. But we recognize that mindfulness isn't for everyone. It's not necessarily a cure-all solution to these destabilizing winds of modern mental hyperstimulation. So many people often think about mindfulness and meditation as a to-do, even a cudgel with which to beat themselves up and say, why aren't I meditating enough? So one of our core propositions is that the simple act of listening to silence, to the breeze, to the rain, even just to the ringing in our ears, can bring profound benefits to health and clarity. Researchers at Duke Medical School found that in mammalian brains, the act of listening to silence regenerates nerve cells, regenerates neurons in the brain at a higher level than other forms of listening. So we talked, for example, to someone who worked as the White House correspondent for Time magazine for some time. And during her really high stress life, she would come home and sit on the couch when she would get home after a busy day and just listen. She didn't have a meditation practice per se, but she would just listen to the ringing in her ears for about 5 minutes. And over time, she would tell us that that ringing in her ears would start to subside. It was almost like something residual from the stress in her day. So without any kind of meditation practice, that act of listening to the silence was how she found her clarity, without any need for training or any kind of special rules and tools.
There's a great number of things that are at risk right now in this noisy world. We are finding more divisions between people all the time. People at work are having a harder time focusing on the work that they care about and need to get done. Relationships are suffering. So our relationship to the earth is in peril. And so we really see that the connection to silence is an opportunity to connect deeply with these things. What is our intention? What is it that we want to focus our attention on? How are our relationships? How are we showing up? We see silence as a pathway to compassion, to empathy, and to insight as well. Stepping back into deep silence, even sharing that silence as we think through these issues, really allows for novel thinking to emerge.
And there's one word that comes to mind with this question of what silence can offer us in making better decisions, in making sense of the world. And that word is discernment. In conversations with the technical experts in medicine and neuroscience and various fields, we found again and again that noise is stress on our bodies and our minds. And in order to make good decisions, but in order to discern what's really true, it's important to be able to tune into silence. We spoke, for example, with Cyrus Habib, who came to the United States as a little boy from Iranian immigrants, went blind when he was 8 years old, then learned Braille, made it through Columbia, Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, Yale Law School, and became lieutenant governor of Washington State when he was 35 years old. And everyone expected Cyrus to become a U.S. senator or that he was next going to run for governor. But he made an announcement surprising everyone that he was taking a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience as a novice Jesuit priest. And what ultimately, though, made him decide to go off and have this radical change in his career was the need to be able to discern. Because he said that amidst all the internal noise of his life, all the thinking of how am I performing? How is this looking on Twitter? How is this looking in a press release? It was impossible to tune in to what was truly producing positive change. So amidst all these different forms of noise, what Cyrus emphasized most was this necessity of getting beyond that kind of ethic of performing constantly, to be able to tune into what's true.
It really felt important to us to look at silence as this real basic place to start from, that it doesn't require all the rules and tools of mindfulness or any kind of particular format. And this book is about really finding your pathway to silence, really noticing what is it that brings you that internal calm and quiet that allows you to connect with what you really want in this world. We heard from people who were finding quiet through chainsaw carving large chunks of wood, or through dance in a really auditorily loud environment, or through flow states of all kinds. And these are more familiar, more accessible. They don't require a lot of, training. We know how to do this as humans. We know how to find our way back to quiet. And this is really about remembering our way back.
One thing we often notice is people feeling bad about themselves for the inability to focus these days. And we want to emphasize that it's not anyone's individual fault per se that it's so tough to focus. A human being is not wired to be able to deal with the mental stimulus that we're encountering today relative to earlier periods of time. So one thing we emphasize in this book is that our society is actually really wired to generate noise. If we think, for example, about how we measure gross domestic product, GDP goes up with the buzzing and roars of industrial machinery, or when there's a new opportunity to be involved in something productive with respect to work late at night. So GDP is measuring how much we're producing in the monetary economy, but it's not measuring oftentimes these moments of pristine attention that we're talking about. It's well known that the value of a pristine forest isn't computed within GDP typically, unless you chop down the wood and sell it at Home Depot. And you can say something similar about pristine human attention. The worth of pristine human attention, enjoying great art, for example, or in a quiet moment of reflection by the ocean, or playing with your children, doesn't count as monetary value unless it turns into eyeballs on a screen that can be used as a basis of advertising revenue. When an app's built-in algorithm deduces that you're in a quiet moment of your day and swoops in with a notification to win your attention, and which boosts usage statistics and can enhance company earnings. We look in the book at some questions of what it could mean to think about metrics of well-being that account for the value of pristine human attention. not just because that's where we find the most happiness and worth, although that is what's most important, but that's also what's necessary for generating transformative ideas that are going to result in the most effective problem solving. But all that said, we do look in the book at a variety of solutions for what it could look like to build a society that honors silence. There's still also the place, of course, for personal action and what's in our sphere of control.
With the sphere of control, we're looking at our individual actions, but also how we are as families, as friends, in workplaces, and as a culture. How can we do these things together, partner together? What is within our sphere of control where we can take immediate action, even if they're small, and where we might be in a place of influence where we're more in a relationship and maybe negotiating, discussing, and making agreements around how to share silence and maybe mitigate the noise together.
One thing we emphasize is the importance of simply appreciating silence, to take some time throughout your day and in a moment of transition to take a pause, maybe opening the door, maybe when you're standing up to leave the room, maybe when you're turning on the tap for some water, to take a quiet moment. And you don't necessarily need to do a meditation practice, but simply notice the moment of silence, to appreciate the moment of silence, and to let that be a source of clarity and reset in that moment. It's not so much about the quantity of the silence, it's the quality. Can we take a moment and go as deeply into the silence as we possibly can, even if it's only with us for a few seconds?
Another thing is sometimes these moments of silence come to us and they may not be initially so welcome. Like maybe our podcast just stops streaming all of a sudden, or we find ourselves in a long line. Something like that, some kind of interruption where silence just comes and finds us, to fall into that silence, to appreciate it deeply, to take that moment, to not go ahead and check our phones and all the other things that we busy and fill ourselves with, but to really pause and notice our surroundings and feel, what is it really like to tap into silence in the midst of this busy day?
Sometimes the word silence can have a connotation of complicity or complacency around what's wrong. Sometimes we hear culturally that even silence is violence. And we respect this notion. It's something we write about with great appreciation in the book. But our contention is that so much of the apathy in the world right now isn't born of silence, but it's born of noise. When we're caught up in paying attention to Instagram likes and gossip and career jockeying and whatever that might be, all that noise makes it difficult to truly focus on living a life of empathy and hearing what's necessary in our lives from the people around us, hearing what's necessary with respect to what's happening in the broader world. So we make this contention in the book that silence is actually an important part of ethics. There's a moral dimension of silence. It's something that Gandhi applied throughout his life, even during the most intense times of the work he was doing, to spend every Monday not speaking, because he said that a seeker after truth needs silence. So this is something that we think we can all tune into, in a sense, in our world today.